In this video, I'm going to share 5 common questions I get about nonprofit boards. Let's get into it. Hey there, this is Tiffany with Boss on a Budget. I help new and small nonprofits get up and running, and also I teach people to raise startup money for their nonprofits. And in this video, we're going to talk all about your board of directors. It's such a juicy topic that I really wanted to highlight 5 common questions that I often get about the board. Now, I have done videos on the board, but sometimes it's hard for people to navigate and figure out all the different videos I've done because I've done a lot. So I want to compile some of the most common questions that I get into this video so that you can have that information when you are launching your nonprofit. If you need a deep dive on boards, I actually did a masterclass. I did over 2 hours of teaching on the purpose of boards, what their duties are, the main responsibilities of board members, all the things. So if you need that masterclass, I am linking that below. So y'all ready? Let's get into this. The first question that I often get is, can you really find board members? Or how do you find board members? I'm just going to combine those questions, especially when you're new and nobody really knows you, right? So yes, the answer is yes, you can find board members. And the follow-up to that was how you find them. Well, you have to open your mouth. And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm really not. But if you're deciding to start a nonprofit, then you have to be, as the founder, one of the biggest ambassadors from your organization starting out. So you can't be afraid to talk about your nonprofit. You can't be afraid to start networking and talking to people, showing up at different networking mixers, showing up at different meetings, joining committees, joining other boards, to find people who are aligned with you, to find people who you like their working style, who their personalities would mesh with your organization, whose values would align with your organization, to help you launch. So the only way you're going to be successful is opening yourself up and beginning to learn and see and interact with other people, because you have no idea who could end up serving on your board. So you are really limiting yourself when you say, oh, I don't know anybody, or I need to only look at the people that I know. You're really limiting yourself. So you really need to expand, to get out of your box, to begin to meet people, but also ask people, who do you think could be a good fit? And have a good idea for yourself what kind of fit you want. Have a good idea for yourself who you're even targeting, who you even want to have on your board, because that will give you a sense of direction too. That will help you figure out where to go, how to navigate to find the right people for your board. Second common question that I get is, can I pay my board members? Or why can't I pay my board members? So let's break this one down. And a lot of people get stumped by this one because they're like, I have board members who are actually active. They're doing the work. They're actually doing our programming. Why can I not pay them? Why would anybody serve on a board and do all that work and not get paid? Now, I have broken this down in a bunch of other videos and also in the board's masterclass that I talked about. So I'll give you a quick rundown here. So for most established nonprofits, there is a clear line between staff people and board. And people who are staff do the day-to-day work. They implement the programming. People who are on the board provide oversight of the organization overall. And so they're setting the strategic vision for the nonprofit. They're not getting into the weeds and actually interfacing much with your clients or your participants. And there's a line there. But when you are new and you don't have a lot of resources, sometimes that line is gray, because your board members may be those people actually doing the services. Your board members may be doing both. They may be providing the services and providing oversight and strategic direction of the organization. And that's often referred to as a working board. And that's out of necessity, because who else is going to do it when you're starting, especially when you don't have money or you have very little money. So the question often comes up, well, if they're doing the work, why can't they be paid? And the reality is that the board has a very specific role. They're supposed to provide oversight. They are not there to benefit for their service. They're not there to receive any kind of benefit. So when there's an appearance that people are serving on a board so that they can benefit in some way, that is a red flag to the IRS. But the reality is you're just doing it because there's nobody else to do the work. So as a board, you all have to decide how you're going to walk that fine line. If anybody who serves on the board is going to get compensated for doing work on the board, not reimbursed, but compensated for the work that they're doing, then that needs to go through a conflict of interest policy and process, and that person who is the subject of that inquiry cannot be involved in that discussion and make that final decision. And so it becomes really tricky. It's a fine line to walk. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you what the final answer should be, and every organization is different, so you're going to have to decide for yourself. I'm just telling you what the norms are and what's expected of you. That in most circumstances, board members do not get paid for nonprofits, and it's not normal for a board member to be compensated as a staff person when they're on the board. But being in the startup phase, it's a little different. And so you may make decisions about hiring or having a board member serve, and that's when you start getting into the weeds around conflict of interest. Now, there are some people who will flat out say, no, a board member should never get paid. They should step down if they're trying to get paid. And I don't necessarily take that hard line, because those people don't really understand what it's like to start from scratch. Those people don't really understand that when you have a board member and that's the person you trust, and a lot of times it's you, the founder. You've done the work in the past, and you got to get paid for doing some of your work, but you're not even getting paid what you really deserve, but you got to get something because you're putting your time in, and you're like, but I still want to serve on the board. So it's a really fine line, and people don't get that the startup phase is a little different, which is why I said examine your conflict of interest policy, make sure you have one, make sure you go through the process, make sure the board is all on board with that decision, and go from there. And if it really gets into the weeds and you're really concerned, consult a lawyer to help you navigate this process. And also want to remind you that I am not a lawyer, and also that I'm not your lawyer. So I need you to find your own counsel for these really tough decisions. Third question I often get is, how do I handle toxic board members? Or how do I handle disengaged or ineffective board members? So I will come at this a bunch of different ways. The first thing I would say is make sure your bylaws are clear on how to add and how to remove board members. So there's going to come a time when a board member who is serving is not appropriate for that role. And so you need to have an outline process for how to get rid of that person, and what are the qualifications, or what's the process to remove that person or any kind of person who's no longer a good fit for the board. So that needs to be clear. I would say first, make sure that's outlined in your bylaws so there's a process. But I also would confront that situation through conversation first. Like, I wouldn't necessarily go to removal, right? I think that's too much in the beginning if you haven't had a conversation with that person yet. If you haven't engaged them, if you haven't made clear about your expectations about serving on a board, if they don't have a board member agreement, if they didn't have a chance to contribute themselves and talk themselves about what they want to do and how they can help, if they haven't had a chance to explain themselves. Because sometimes if they're disengaged, it may be something came up from, their job or their family, and they may not want to say or may not want to step down and be in denial about their ability to really serve. That's really what happens a lot of times. But sometimes you do have a toxic board member, and you can talk to them all you want, but they're just not the best fit. They really are harming the organization. And in those circumstances, I would say make sure you're very clear on your processes and you follow your processes to remove that person. This next one is a question that I often see in my comments on YouTube. Do I really need a board? Or can I just do this by myself? So the answer to that question is yes, you need a board. And when people ask that question, that is a signal for me that that person doesn't really understand how nonprofits are set up. Now, some of y'all watching this video are going to get mad about what I'm going to say, but I'm just telling you what it is. And then you got to decide for yourself how to move on from there. But you're not creating a nonprofit for yourself. You're not creating a nonprofit as your own business. That is not the point of starting a nonprofit. And I think a lot of people who start nonprofits come in with that mindset. And it's either because They just didn't know that you don't own a nonprofit. They don't know it's not theirs. Or they're like, well, somebody else runs it like it's their own, so I'm going to run it like that. But the reality is there's no ownership right to a nonprofit just because you're a founder. You are one of several people on your board who are making decisions, and you can't be the only person making decisions. You can't be the only person directing where the organization will go and the decisions it will make. But why is that? Because a lot of people don't understand why. Because for most of y'all watching this, you're going to be designated as a public charity if you have 501c3 status. And so that's a privilege. And the privilege is that you don't have to pay income tax. And so if the IRS granted you that privilege, they're going to want to make sure that you're not using that status as a way to benefit yourself. And there's no real way to have checks and balances to make sure that someone's not unfairly benefiting if there's only one person who's providing oversight. If you don't have multiple people who can be that check and balances. This is like the most simple answer and simple way I can lay it down to you. In order to protect that status, then the IRS is interested in who's all on that board, who's serving, to make sure that that status is protected. So when you serve as a board member, you have to remember you have a very serious role. You have a legal and an ethical duty to serve on that board and to make the best decisions for that nonprofit. You are loyal to the nonprofit. You're not loyal to the founder when you serve on a board. And when there's only one person serving on a board, then that doesn't exist. You can't help but be loyal to the founder, because that founder, who's probably the only person on the board, all that matters is the decisions you make. And that's an issue. That's a red flag for the IRS, because it's like you get to control public funds. You get to collect money and not pay taxes on it. How are you using that money? They're going to be very, very curious. How are you making decisions about where that money goes? And we're not seeing any of it? Y'all, you see where I'm going with this? So to answer the question, yes, you need a board. And it's actually, I know your next question is going to be what my last one I want to talk about is. But just to finish this part up, yes, you need a board, and each state will dictate how many you need to incorporate your organization and how many you need to satisfy the board requirement in the state. And the last question that I'm going to cover today is, how many board members should I have on my board? All right, you should have anticipated I was going to say this. So this question depends, and I'll just tell you just generally what happens. So the IRS likes to see at least 3 people who serve on a board, and it's good practice to have your officers. So have a president, a secretary, and a treasurer at a minimum. And so at a minimum, you need at least 3 people to serve on your board. Now, the regulation for starting a nonprofit happens at the state. So you're going to have to know your state rules and your state laws about how many board members you are required to have at a minimum and how many board members are required to start your organization. That is state law. The IRS does not dictate that. So you got to look at state law first and then think about implications for the IRS. But since most of you all are getting 501c3 status, if you don't have it already, then you need to also think about the IRS, which is at least 3 people is what they like to see. Now, that doesn't answer the question, but how many is a good number? And the answer is it depends. It depends on how much money you're trying to raise. It depends on how big you want your network to grow. It depends on the scope of your organization and how big your organization is or how you want it to grow. And so that's a strategic question. So that's not a question that somebody who you randomly listen to on YouTube can answer for you. You have to decide for yourself, how big do I want to grow? Like I said, how much money do I trying to raise, right? And if any of that is big, if any of that is a lot, then you know you're going to need at least 5 people to help execute a major vision. But it doesn't necessarily have to be 50, but it's going to have to be enough people to help steer you in that direction. And remember, when you're a startup, you're typically a working board. So you don't want to put all of the pressure or all of the work on a small number of people. And the reality is this: whenever you're doing group work, you remember these group projects from school, there's always going to be a small percentage that are not going to pull their weight. So you also have to consider that as well when it comes to deciding how many people. You know, if you have 5 people, well, at least 3 might be good. At least 3 might be doing something, but there's a chance there's 1 or 2 that might not. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. If you need help recruiting board members, I also have a board recruitment toolbox that I am listing below that gives you tools and tips for finding board members. And if you need help with your nonprofit, you can visit me at www.bossonabudget.com, and I'll see you in the next video.